Hello everyone, and today I'll be here to walk you through my process of coloring my illustration. As you can see, I am starting with a sketch that is already completed. So this video will not actually cover the process, be it the drawing process or the thought process behind this particular piece. I think you'll be able to find something like this in other YouTube videos, or maybe I can create one in future. But this video specifically covers my coloring process, and for this particular piece, I'm actually thinking about not making the background fill the entire page. So I'm kind of doing like this graphical crop out of the background to better highlight the character. So for this particular piece, I am going straight into colors. I'm not going with the grayscale to color sort of a process. I guess personally, I prefer going straight into colors because I find that the grayscale process produces somewhat dull looking colors, but that's just my personal preference. Okay, so my first step would be to actually block out the colors, and I'm using the line art as a guide, but because my line art for this particular piece is pretty rough, I would say that I am just using it as a rough guide. I will be making some changes here and there when I'm blocking in the colors. So the process of blocking out the colors, I'm basically using the lasso tool, and I'm using it to kind of draw a somewhat abstract looking shape that represents the canopy. The good thing about the lasso tool is that it allows you to create this kind of organic selection as opposed to something like the pen tool. So once the selection is done, I use this custom brush over here, which I can link in the description box below if you are interested to download it. However, do note that it's a paid product. With that said, you can actually just use the default paint bucket tool to kind of achieve very similar results. The good thing about this brush is that it creates a very slight hint of a color variation as you are painting your selection, which does add a little bit of randomness, and it produces colors that I can later sample into the rest of the image when I'm blending and doing detailing later. But for the most part, as I mentioned, you can use the paint bucket tool. So the reason why I am kind of doing this first is to quickly just throw in all the main colors into the canvas, right? And this allows me to have a quick preview of what the final artwork will look like. Okay, this is especially crucial when you're working for a client project, because sometimes they may require you to give periodic updates, periodic work in progress. And to be honest, at this stage, you are probably not spending like a lot of time because you're just doing selection and then more or less just applying a few color, right? So this enables you to kind of give a snapshot of the final product without too much time invested. And if the client is not happy with the direction that you're going, he or she can quickly, put a pause to it or give you some additional directions as to where they want to take this particular illustration. Even if it's not done for a client project, even if it's just your own personal project, I would highly recommend that you do something like this. At the end of the day, you want to solve as many design problems, as many color issues as soon as possible, and at this very rough state, because later on when we start to move into details, we will probably zoom into the document, and sometimes you may lose sight of the overall composition. So as you can see over here right now, I am zoomed in a little bit, but for the most part, you can see more or less 90% of the artwork. When I am applying colors, I am also mindful about the values. So it's always a good idea to create a new layer and fill it with black and set it to the saturation layer blend mode to preview the value of your painting right now. But for me, I guess I have done this enough time to kind of be able to tell certain values just from the color itself. So in general, I will recommend that you do something either from light to dark, from the background to the foreground, light to dark in terms of the value, or do a reverse where it's dark in the background and light in the foreground. So in this case, for this illustration, I'm actually doing the first direction where it's lighter in the background and darker in the foreground. Another question that I usually get is how do I decide on the colors? So there are a few pointers that I can share. The first is I actually use the standard color schemes, right? For example, my favorite color scheme will be the split complementary color scheme. Okay, sometimes I do use the classic complementary color scheme as well, but I find that the split complementary color scheme usually produces the right amount of hue contrast that I'm looking for in my paintings. And of course, you can try other color schemes as well, analogous, triadic. Again, there are a lot of resources out there already. So I would not go too much into details what all this terminology mean. I believe you can Google and find out. So another color scheme that is really super safe, you would not go wrong if you were to choose this color scheme, will be something along the line of the earth tone colors. And this is especially so if you are working on a forest scene like I am doing right now. Another thing that you can try, especially if you are really new, is to sample colors from existing artworks or photographs. And this is, to be honest, this is something that I do a lot when I kind of first start out as well. Even today, I would do something similar, but not quite. So, okay, let me just break down how to use this method. You can go on to any website that you like, ArtStation, Instagram, Pinterest, to find a illustration that you like. Okay, so after you have that illustration, go ahead and copy and paste it into Photoshop. And for sure, you can just straight away sample colors using the eyedropper tool, but an additional step that you can take to simplify that process. Because if you have found an image that has a lot of gradients, a lot of subtle, hue shifts in the image, it can be difficult to sample the correct color. So to simplify the process, what you can do is to actually apply a mosaic filter on it. This will reduce the number of colors and is actually super handy when you are trying to sample colors from the image. Okay, but personally, I think one good thing to train, especially if you want to pursue this domain of like creating concept art or doing illustrations like this, is to actually train your eye to be able to detect the color just by looking at it. Okay, so one exercise you can do is that once you have identified the color scheme that you want to go with, you can start to sample color, or rather you can try to pick up that color in the Photoshop color wheel or the color, I think it's called the color mixer or something like that, and try to try to identify the correct color just based on what you see. Okay, so you don't use the eyedropper tool at all. So I find that that is a good way to train your eye to be able to distinguish between the different colors. So one last thing before I jump to the next section would be that it is possible at the end of the day to use colors that are outside of the traditional color scheme. So you could use colors all over the color wheel, right? You can have yellow, you can have red, you can have purple, blue, green, you just throw every color into the mix. But for them to be harmonious, to live side by side each other within your painting and not look out of place, one trick that I find to be super useful is to make sure that the colors you choose, the colors that you select, belongs to the same temperature. So for example, in this painting right here, I have a body of water, like a stream flowing down the hill, and it's kind of merging into this small river over here. Okay, and I'm using blue for this river part, right? So traditionally, you would think that, oh, blue and even the green hues on the grass is like a cool color, right? And I'm also mixing in later on, I'm also mixing in orange and yellow, and just hearing this, it feels like they would clash. However, because the blue tone that I'm using for the river is a warm blue tone, it actually fits into the entire composition. The tone of green that I'm using for the grass is a warm green, and because of that, it fits into the entire composition. Right? So to summarize, when you are choosing colors, just be aware that every single color has a warm tone and a cool tone. And you will want to use colors that belong to the same temperature within the same painting. Okay, so this entire illustration, I'm going with the warm kind of temperature. And because of that, even though I'm using blues, greens, and later on you'll see I'm using orange, it's not out of place. Okay, so now that the blocking of the colors is mostly done, I will create a new layer and fill it with black and set it to the saturation layer blend mode. Okay, this will allow me to check the values of the painting so far. And when I'm looking at this, I'm trying to evaluate if things are clear. All right. If it's not clear, I can play around with the hue saturation adjustment, and I can kind of push certain things back. For example, right now, the tree trunk in the midground is kind of has the same value as the hair of the character. So I'm trying to push it into the background by lowering the lightness. Okay, and because I've lowered the lightness of the mid-ground tree trunk, I would also do the same for the other tree trunks. And over here, I'm actually pushing the character more closer to the camera by making her a bit darker. As I mentioned just now, I am using a light to dark transition, so the objects near the background will be much lighter and the objects in the foreground will be darker. And because all of these elements are in their own layers and everything is sort of like a flat color, it is a lot easier to make these adjustments as compared to if you already throw in a lot of details and all that. It'll be a pain to try to correct your image. The next step is to create the shadow layers. To do so, first you have to define where the key light source is coming from. Now, I think that the easiest solution for this is to set the key light source to be either on the top right or the top left of the canvas. There's no hard and fast rule as to where the light source needs to be, but I think setting it on the top right or top left will be the most straightforward thing to consider if you are a beginner. Once you have defined where the key light source is, then we would know where to place our shadow shapes. The shadow shapes would appear in the opposite direction as the key light source. So in my painting, I set the key light to be on the top right, and therefore the shadows should appear on the bottom left. To create the shadow shapes, I use the lasso tool to once again draw out where I think the shadows should be. Next, I use the same brush to apply a grayish purple tone on the selected shapes. The reason why I use grayish purple is because purple is a complementary color to yellow, which is what I want the key light source to be, the sunlight. I find that applying a complementary color to the key light for the shadow is a good way to make your shadows richer. If you simply use a darker variant of the base color, for example, if you are painting the skin tone, in this case it's kind of a brownish tone, if you just apply a dark brown, it will kind of flatten out the image and make the end result look really boring. So by applying a color, in this case a dull purple, it actually makes it much richer. Of course, right now it looks a bit strange to have a dull purple, so convert the layer blend mode to multiply and you'll get a proper shadow color. Next, I will move on to apply the same shadow on the background object. Alright, with the base colors blocked in and the shadows done up, to be honest, at least a good 75% of the painting is done. Alright, sure, right now it's at this like very graphical form, but the core, the illustration is completed. You kind of know what to expect for the final result. So I think I need to re-emphasize this point. Spend a good amount of time thinking about, what are some of the steps that would eventually lead you to be able to do this. Because if this part is done well, the rest of the painting is just, it will be very smooth. It will be easy, right? You are just kind of adding in details, right? But the core is solid already, even at this like very rough stage. Okay, so never ever move on to detailing until this is done, until this is like you are happy with what you see right now. Okay, with that said though, it is time to do details. And some people, maybe they don't like to do details because it's very time consuming, but somehow I really love to do details. Maybe it's got something to do with me, when I was young, I liked to play Japanese RPGs, and to me, doing all these details, right, it's kind of like grinding in a JRPG game. Okay, so my process of detailing, okay, to be honest, I think that there's not much to say about details. But my process would be to work from foreground to background. Okay, When I first started out, I did the reverse. I started with the background first. Like I will paint the clouds first, and then slowly make my way forward until I end up with the character. But I guess with experience, I find that maybe I don't have time to spend on like one. I don't have as much time to spend on one piece as compared to back in my youth where I have all the time in the world. So I do think that working from front to back is actually much more time efficient because for the most part the background usually do not require so much details. For the viewer, they will usually just concentrate their attention on the character or whatever that's in the foreground. So if you spend too much time initially on the background, you will find that you need to put in even more effort, on the foreground elements just to have that sort of textural contrast between the foreground and the background. And I would say that typically you are the most energetic, right, at the start of the process, and then your motivation levels usually taper off as you get as you are approaching the midway point of your illustration creation. And I would say that you should hang on to this like high motivation stage and just kind of use all that energy for your character first. So another thing that I find myself doing nowadays as compared to in the past is that I will actually merge in the line art layer. So previously I mentioned this started off as kind of like a pretty rough sketch. I did not do a detailed or clean line pass for this particular illustration. With that said, though, I still decided to kind of merge that very rough line drawing in. And the reason for this is because there are some problems that I have already fixed during this rough sketch phase. For example, some of the anatomy, right? Some of the details of the character's costume. So it's already kind of hinted, even with my rough strokes. So I do like to incorporate that back into my painting because okay, so in the past I tend to just forgo the line art completely and kind of start anew. And looking back, it's a bit of a waste of time because like I mentioned, I've already solved some problems with my line art. So why don't I just reuse my line art, right? So this is something that I do nowadays. Another thing that I would do is that when I'm painting the details, I will do a lot of flipping, right? I will flip my image. And I do that so often, I actually binded the keys to a specific shortcut that is easily, accessible by my left hand, right? I will bind flip horizontal to Control Q. Right, but don't press Control Q right now, expecting the canvas to flip because Control Q by default I think is to close the document. So I already went through the process of changing the keyboard shortcuts to kind of suit my painting needs. The point of flipping the canvas is for you to have a fresh view of the drawing. Sometimes when we are so zoomed in, or if we are already working on this same piece for I don't know like 2 hours, you may lose sight of certain things like proportion. You may lose sense of the balance of the character. So by flipping it, it actually gives you a new perspective of your drawing, and from there you can actually start to identify certain errors, certain mistakes that were kind of hidden from you when you are staring at this painting from the other orientation. Another thing that I would do is I would actually open a separate window, right? So you can do this in using the navigation, I think the navigation panel, but the way I did mine is to actually create another window for this document. Okay, because I find that having another window actually allows me the flexibility of actually painting. I can actually paint in the other window as well. It's not something that I do a lot, but the flexibility is there. But the whole idea of having another window to dock another window where I can see it is so that I can have a wide view of the entire illustration as I'm working on it. You know how some traditional artists, when they paint on their canvases, they actually take a step back occasionally, to have a wider view of the illustration, to kind of see everything as in a big picture kind of form. This is basically what you are doing when you have a small preview of the entire illustration. Because sometimes when we are too zoomed in, we might be like bogged down by the details and kind of forget that you are actually working on this entire piece and not just on the face. When painting, it is important to take note of the different materials that are found in the objects in your scene. So for example, you should be aware that things like metal will react differently to light as compared to the skin, as compared to, in this case, leaves, trees, water. They all have different material properties. And this can get a bit technical, it can get a bit deep. So once again, I'm not gonna, talk too much about this topic in this video, but you should definitely practice, rendering different materials, because it will be useful if when you are trying to paint a slightly more complicated scene like this, where there's a mixture of different materials. I think another popular question that a lot of beginner artists will ask a somewhat more experienced artists is, oh, what kind of brushes that you use? And I guess it's kind of like a meme, and a lot of so-called more experienced artists will kind of laugh at this question because they used to ask this when they first started out as well. I personally think that okay, so a lot of experienced artists, they say that, oh, brush doesn't matter, it's more about your knowledge. I do think, however, that no doubt that it is possible that you can achieve the same results with the default number 19 brush, the default Photoshop brush. But it's just way harder, right? And it's more time consuming. And there are certain qualities, maybe in terms of the textures, the kind of textures, the paint stroke qualities that you'll not be able to achieve with the number 19 brush. I would say that brushes are important. Okay, so for me personally, I like to use hard brush. Okay, I make sure that my paintings are a reasonable large size, and then I'm using hard brush. And the reason for using a big canvas is because when you use hard brush, right, people might be able to see your brush strokes. But when you paint it in a big canvas and the final product is kind of down rest, so perhaps you do on a 4K by 4K canvas and then you export it as a 1K by 1K or 2K by 2K image, right? A lot of the details will kind of be down res, and it makes their brush strokes less visible. The reason why I personally prefer a hard brush than a soft brush is because I find that it is much easier to recreate different material qualities using the hard brush. I find that if you use too much soft brush, everything will just look kind of muddy and soft, and therefore it looks very uniform, like everything is made out of cloth. I do use soft brush mainly for blending the skin tones, because usually, especially for female characters, you want to have them to have somewhat smooth looking skin, and sometimes with the hard brush, right, the transition of gradients might be a bit harsh and might not reflect well on the female skin. The last bit of advice that I can give is that whenever in doubt, always look back at your reference. If you find that your reference materials are insufficient, Google for more references. Like for example, if I'm stuck at the hair, I don't know how to paint hair. Well, the easiest way is to just Google for hair images, right? And then you can use those as sort of a reference point and paint according to what you see. Another advice that I can give is don't linger in one area for too long. All right, paint and then move on. If you're stuck, find references. Don't try to paint and then undo, paint and then undo. You end up wasting a lot of time when you do that. Or don't paint on something and then 5 minutes later paint the exact same strokes again on that area. I know a lot of artists tend to do that. I myself, sometimes I would revert back to this behavior, but always be aware of what you're doing. Don't suddenly go into autopilot mode just because I enjoy doing detailing, right? Sometimes I do go into this autopilot mode and I'm not aware of what I'm doing, and then I realize that before long I realized that I spend like 10-20 minutes on the hair, which is not a very efficient use of time. Okay, so you want to paint something and then move on. Don't try to paint and paint over that same stroke again and again. It's just very time consuming. And the last bit of advice before we kind of fast forward this detailing part is to keep your layers clean. Now, for this particular painting, I try to keep it simple. I basically group the elements based on the main character, her pet bird, and the environment. The reason why you still want to keep this somewhat clean, like for example, I don't blend in, I don't combine the layers between my character and the environment, is so that it will be much easier for you to edit if you need to. Right? Like I said, you shouldn't make this kind of high level edits right now because you should have already kind of cleared them before you move into detailing. But suppose that something you kind of missed out on something completely. At least it's not the end of the world. You can still make major shifts. Like for example, if I need to shift the character 3 pixels to my right. If the character is already merged with the background, then it's gonna be very difficult to do so. Right, so as much as possible, I try to keep each element on its own individual layer. Okay, so the painting is pretty much done in terms of detailing at this point. The next step is to apply the finishing touches. The first thing I would usually do is to paint in some light. How I will do this is to create a new layer, fill it with black, and using a soft brush and a light color, I would start to dab in where I think the light is supposed to be, hitting the focal point. So for this particular painting, I'm using yellow, right? Because my main light source is the sun. But I'm also mixing in a little hint of an orange because I do want the bird, right, to have some kind of glow. Kind of like as if the bird is on fire, but not really. So like I mentioned, I will just lightly dab on areas where the light is hitting these focal points just to illuminate these areas a bit more. To introduce a bit more movement into the scene, I would add in small brush strokes like this to kind of suggest dust, grass, feathers, or petals kind of flying in the air. Again, this is to suggest some kind of movement, be it from the wind or from the character doing her action and thereby, causing some grass to be uprooted from the soil. It's not very realistic if you think about it, but it adds a lot of interest, all right, and it adds a lot of movement to the whole scene. The next thing I will do is to import in some grunge textures. Okay, once I've imported them in, I will set them to be a overlay blend mode, and I will lower the opacity. These grunge textures, what they do is they introduce an additional layer of textures, and the colors that are within these grunge textures will also be applied to the painting as well. Right? So basically, these grunge textures are giving me some freebies, right? Some things that will take me very long to achieve with just paint strokes alone. Okay, and it also gives a very basic level of color correction. So I'm just playing around. I don't quite know if a particular texture will work or not. So I'm just playing around with the blend modes, playing around with the opacity of the layer and see if this particular texture is adding anything to the painting. If it's not, I can very easily discard it. Of course, it's easy to go overboard with this, so just be mindful that you don't kind of destroy your painting by overdoing certain things. The next thing I would do is I will create a curves blend mode, a curves adjustment layer. Okay, and this will allow me to tweak the exposure values of the painting. So I usually work in a dual monitor kind of setup. And I find that sometimes when I'm working on my primary, Wacom display, things might look very dark in other monitors. So what I would usually do is I will move that secondary document window that I've created earlier into another screen. Okay, and then I'll try to play around with the curves and make sure that it looks good on that screen as well. Once the exposure values are set, I will create another adjustment layers using the color balance. Okay, what I'm doing right now is I'm just trying to tweak the colors to make sure that it is the best possible combination. Now, a lot of people feel that what I'm doing right now, right, with the grunge textures, doing the curves, doing the color balance, it's kind of like a cheat because ideally you want to already settle your colors when you paint them, right? Just choose the correct color and then just paint it. But I liken this process to that of applying an Instagram filter, right? A lot of people when they upload their artwork, not a lot of people. Some people, they like to use the pre-existing Instagram filters to modify and enhance their artwork. Okay, I see no problem with that. So I feel that this process, right, is actually similar to that. You are trying to make sure that the color combination of the artwork is the best possible color combination. So I don't think it's too much of a cheat. Okay, with that said, that's the end of this walkthrough. I hope that you learned something about my process. And yeah, hopefully you can apply it to your own painting as well.